They say Hollywood was built on dreams, but it survived on secrets. For every shining star on the screen, there was a shadow waiting to be uncovered. In March of 2007, an article appeared in Hollywood Truth magazine. Its headlines sent shockwaves through the entire industry. The discovery of Burt Lancaster's secret notebook. Inside that old, worn journal were 14 names, each belonging to one of the most adored legends of Hollywood's golden age. But next to each name, Lancaster had written chilling words, confessions, warnings, and accusations that would forever stain their perfect images. Some dismissed it as rumor, the delusion of a man near the end of his life. Others whispered that Lancaster had uncovered something too real, something powerful people wanted buried forever. Burt Lancaster was not just a movie star. He was a man who had marched beside Martin Luther King Jr., a man known for his integrity, his courage, and his refusal to be silent in the face of injustice. So when he wrote those words, he wasn't seeking revenge. He was leaving behind a message, a final testament to the world he had seen crumble behind the bright lights of fame. This was not a memoir. It was a warning. Each page revealed the truth about the people the world thought they knew, the legends who smiled for cameras while hiding cruelty, manipulation, and fear in the shadows of their fame. Burt Lancaster had looked behind the curtain, and what he saw changed him forever. 14 names, 14 stories. 14 confessions from the dark heart of Hollywood itself. The first name on that list was one the world adored, a woman whose beauty defined an era, whose eyes could both seduce and destroy. Elizabeth Taylor. To the world, she was the very definition of beauty, the woman whose violet eyes could capture the camera, the queen of every room she entered. But inside those eyes there was a storm, one that never stopped raging. In 1962, during the filming of Cleopatra at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, the world saw her as a goddess draped in gold. Yet, behind the scenes, something far more dangerous was unfolding. Taylor locked herself in her dressing room, refusing to see anyone, not the director, not her co-stars, not even the producers who were losing thousands of dollars every minute. Her reason was as strange as it was revealing. Another actress had worn a dress in the same color as hers. The production halted for nearly 14 hours. Crew members waited in silence as whispers spread through the set. When the director finally confronted her, Taylor held a glass of wine at his face. That single act told everyone the truth. Elizabeth Taylor was not just a star. She was a force of control. She knew her power, and she wielded it without mercy. During the 1960s, when she married actor Richard Burton, their love became one of the most public obsessions in Hollywood history. But what the headlines never revealed was the battle happening behind closed doors. Taylor didn't just love Burton, she owned him. She took control of his career, his choices, his identity. With every film they made together, her influence deepened until even the most powerful producers bowed to her will. Her marriages were not tales of passion, they were wars for dominance. Each husband became a stepping stone, a pawn in a game she played better than anyone. Mike Todd, Eddie Fisher, Richard Burton, men who thought they could tame her, only to discover they were being consumed by her need to rule every aspect of her world. Hollywood adored her as a goddess, But Burt Lancaster's notebook described something far colder. He wrote that Elizabeth Taylor did not seek love, she sought control. Behind the charm and glamour was a calculating mind that turned every relationship into a negotiation of power. To the cameras, she smiled like a queen. But when the lights went out, she was a storm unpredictable, untouchable, and unstoppable. Lancaster believed she symbolized everything that was wrong with the Hollywood machine. Beauty turned the sea into a weapon, fame used as control, and love replaced by manipulation. She was not just one of the brightest stars of her time, she was also one of its darkest forces. And on the next page of Lancaster's secret diary, the name written in his trembling hand revealed a darkness even more disturbing, a man whose charm and heroism on screen concealed a monster within, Kirk Douglas. To the public, he was a hero, the man with the fierce jawline and unshakable confidence, the warrior who fought injustice on screen, who inspired millions through the power of his performances. But the truth, according to Burt Lancaster's secret notebook, was something far darker. In his private notes, Lancaster described Douglas not as a man, but as a predator. He wrote, "Behind the hero's smile was a hunger that no success could ever feed." Those who worked with him saw flashes of it: the cold stare when someone questioned him, the sudden temper when things didn't go his way, the way people around him walked on eggshells, afraid to make even the smallest mistake. Douglas had mastered the art of duality. To the cameras, he was noble, passionate, strong, the everyman hero that audiences loved. Off camera, he was a different creature entirely. He thrived on control, on the quiet fear he inspired in others. He didn't need to shout. His power came from silence, the kind of silence that could suffocate a room. Lancaster wrote that Douglas had an obsession with dominance. He wanted not just to be the best, he wanted to be untouchable. Directors feared him, co-stars avoided confronting him, even producers, men with far more money and influence, bent to his will because he had something they didn't: the unwavering devotion of the public. He knew that as long as America saw him as a hero, he could do anything behind the curtain. And he did. There was one name that appeared again and again in Lancaster's diary: Lisa Avery, a young actress who had been set to star in a major film alongside Douglas in 1959. The story went that she refused an invitation to a private dinner with him, thinking little of it. Days later, she was suddenly dropped from the project without explanation. Her career never recovered. Lancaster wrote, "He punished her not because she refused him, but because she dared to believe she had a choice." That was Kirk Douglas's true power, not his fame, not his fortune, but his ability to destroy with a whisper. He didn't raise his hand or his voice. He simply made a call, and someone disappeared. He built his empire not only through talent, but through intimidation, manipulating casting lists, controlling publicity, and silencing anyone who stood in his way. And when silence wasn't enough, Lancaster claimed, Douglas turned to something even darker. There were stories, whispers of private parties, of nights when boundaries blurred, when alcohol and drugs became tools of control. He would invite producers, actors, even journalists, and make them complicit in his excesses. Those who participated owed him their silence. Those who didn't were ruined. Lancaster noted that Douglas used these moments not for pleasure, but for power. He didn't just want to indulge, he wanted to own the people around him. He treated fear as currency, Lancaster wrote, and he spent it freely. One passage stood out from the rest. "The audience saw Spartacus. I saw the man who became him." To Lancaster, Douglas's greatest performance wasn't on screen. It was his life. He played the hero so convincingly that no one dared believe he could be the villain. He didn't just hide behind fame, he weaponized it. And yet, even as the years passed and Hollywood praised him as a legend, a small circle of people whispered about the truth about the actresses who vanished from sets, about the projects suddenly rewritten, about the quiet terror that followed in his wake. To the world, Kirk Douglas was strength, courage, and perseverance. But in the diary of Burt Lancaster, he was something else entirely: a reminder that sometimes the most celebrated heroes are the ones who commit their darkest crimes in plain sight. Lancaster ended Douglas' chapter with a single haunting line. He looked like a man, but what lived inside him was something colder than flesh. And if the truth was difficult to believe, the next name in the notebook would shake Hollywood even more. It was the name of a woman whose eyes had deceived millions, whose tears could move entire audiences, and whose manipulations destroyed lives behind the curtain. Natalie Wood. A name that once shimmered across the silver screen like a reflection of innocence. The girl with the soft smile and tearful eyes, the perfect embodiment of vulnerability. To millions, she was purity itself. But to those who truly knew her, she was a master of illusion. Burt Lancaster wrote that Natalie Wood was not merely an actress, she was an architect of deception. Every tear that rolled down her cheek, every trembling word she delivered was not emotion, it was calculation. He described her as a woman who could make suffering look beautiful and use it to bend others to her will. And for years, that talent made her unstoppable. She began as a child, star adored, celebrated, and used. The industry crafted her image carefully, the fragile flower who had grown up too fast, who longed to be loved, who only wanted peace. But Natalie learned quickly that in Hollywood, weakness could be power if you learned how to perform it well enough. By the time she reached her 20s, she had perfected the role. Behind that delicate appearance was a strategist. She knew what the directors wanted to see, what the press wanted to hear, and how to make anyone around her believe they were the most important person in her life until they no longer served her purpose. Lancaster's notebook revealed moments that never reached the tabloids. He wrote of a film production halted for 10 hours because Natalie suddenly fainted during a scene. Doctors were called, cameras stopped rolling. The director begged her to rest. But when the producers replaced one of her co-stars, the very man she disliked, she recovered miraculously and returned to the set as if nothing had happened. It wasn't illness, it was theater. And she had played her audience perfectly. Her manipulation extended far beyond the screen. In private, she used charm as a weapon. She had a way of making men fall under her spell. Producers, journalists, fellow actors, each convinced they were special, that they truly understood her pain. And once they believed that, they were trapped. Like Esther wrote, she could make a man feel like her savior, then destroy him with a single whisper. The press adored her, and she knew how to feed them stories that painted her as tragic and misunderstood. It was her shield, her mask. Behind it, she maneuvered carefully, ensuring that no scandal, no rumor, no truth could ever catch up with her. But power built on deceit always cracks. And for Natalie, the cracks began to show. In the final months of her life, something changed. Those close to her began to speak of fear, an unnamed anxiety that seemed to haunt her every move. A journalist from the Hollywood Reporter confided to Lancaster that, just weeks before her death, Natalie had threatened to ruin a friend's career unless they followed her orders regarding a private matter. Lancaster never disclosed what that matter was, only that it had to do with betrayal, and that Natalie was desperate to protect an image that was beginning to crumble. Then came that cold night in 1981, on the yacht Splendor, a night that still lives in whispers. Natalie Wood was found lifeless in the dark waters near Catalina Island. The official reports called it an accident, a tragic fall. But Burt Lancaster didn't believe it. In his notebook, he wrote one line that still sends shivers down the spine. The sea did not kill her, it only kept her secrets. Those words suggest a truth no one dared to say aloud, that her death may have been the final act in a life built on manipulation, lies, and control. Whether she was victim or orchestrator, no one can say for certain. But in the end, the same qualities that made her a star also became her downfall. She could deceive the cameras, but she could not deceive fate. Lancaster concluded her chapter with haunting precision. She cried on command until her final day. Only this time there was no audience left to applaud. Her death marked not just the end of a life, but the closing of an era, the moment when the world began to see that Hollywood's golden light always came with a shadow. And yet, as dark as her story was, the next name in Lancaster's diary revealed a cruelty that went beyond manipulation. A man who didn't just play the villain, but lived as one. A man who drew pleasure from the pain of others, who turned laughter into a weapon and control into an art. Mickey Rooney. For decades, his name was synonymous with joy. The smiling boy with boundless energy, the face that made audiences laugh and dream during Hollywood's golden age. To the public, he was innocence itself, the eternal child of the silver screen. But behind the curtain, Burt Lancaster described a man entirely different. A man who hid his demons behind his grin. A man who, in Lancaster's own words, fed on humiliation the way others feed on applause. Rooney's story begins like a fairy tale. He was the child star who conquered Hollywood, adored by millions before he was even old enough to drive. He performed with charm, wit, and timing that no one could rival. But early fame is rarely a blessing. It is a curse disguised as a gift. By his 20s, the sweetness had begun to rot. The boy who once danced across the screen had discovered something darker than performance power. Lancaster wrote that Rooney's cruelty was not sudden. It grew slowly like a shadow stretching across his life. He mocked others not because he hated them, but because it made him feel alive. He had learned early on that the world was either laughing at you or laughing with you, and he would rather be the one holding the joke, no matter who it destroyed. On film sets, he became infamous for a sharp tongue. He would ridicule background actors for their looks, their clothes, even the way they stood. Crew members learned to stay silent, to avoid eye contact, to endure the humiliation until the day's shoot was over. For Rooney, this was sport, an outlet for the rage that burned behind his smile. Burt Lancaster recalled one particular moment that haunted him. During the filming of a light-hearted comedy in the 1960s, Rooney turned on a young actress who had forgotten a line. In front of everyone, he unleashed a storm of insults, mocking her until she broke down in tears. The crew froze. And when she ran from the set, Rooney laughed not nervously, not out of guilt, but with satisfaction. He enjoyed watching others collapse, Lancaster wrote, as if their pain proved his own power. But his cruelty didn't end on set. It followed him home. Behind closed doors, Mickey Rooney's charm turned into domination. He was married 8 times, and every marriage followed the same pattern: passion, control, and collapse. Lancaster's diary spoke of women who adored him, but found themselves trapped in a cycle of manipulation and violence. He described how Rooney would alternate between affection and fury, breaking spirits, the same way he broke objects in his home. One incident, recorded by a witness on set, revealed him slapping his wife in front of the crew because she arrived late to visit him. The room fell silent, but no one dared intervene. Because Rooney wasn't just another actor, he was a Hollywood institution. To challenge him was to risk your career. He had become the very thing the public believed he could never be, a man who used his fame to crush those weaker than him. And the saddest part, Lancaster noted, was that Mickey Rooney saw nothing wrong with it. He believed cruelty was simply strength, that power meant never having to apologize. He mistook fear for respect, Lancaster wrote, and by the end, that was all he had left. Even as his fame faded and his roles became fewer, Rooney's temper did not. He became bitter, paranoid, convinced that others were conspiring against him. The boy who once represented the joy of cinema had turned into a man consumed by his own bitterness, a mirror reflecting the darker truth of Hollywood itself, that success, when unrestrained, can twist the soul. Lancaster concluded Rooney's chapter with words that seemed to carry both pity and disgust. He spent a lifetime performing for applause, but what he truly wanted was control. The stage gave him fame. Cruelty gave him purpose. Mickey Rooney's story was not one of tragedy, but transformation from beloved star to tyrant of his own making. He was proof that Hollywood doesn't just create idols, it also builds monsters who learn to smile while they destroy. And yet, as the pages of the diary turned darker, one name stands out, perhaps the most shocking of all, a name that symbolized beauty, desire, and fragility, a name that carried both myth and misery. Marilyn Monroe. The name alone still shimmers like light reflected on broken glass, beautiful, blinding, and sharp enough to cut. To the world, she was innocence wrapped in silk, the dream that Hollywood sold to every lonely heart. But in Burt Lancaster's notebook, she was something far more dangerous. He called her the black hole that devoured everyone who came too close. Marilyn's life was a paradox from the beginning. She had been born Norma Jean Mortensen, a girl who spent her childhood drifting through foster homes, learning early that survival required performance. Every smile had to be earned, every gesture rehearsed. By the time she became Marilyn Monroe, the performance had become the person. There was no line between the woman and the illusion. Hollywood adored her vulnerability. It made people feel protective. But Marilyn had learned that being fragile could be power if she controlled when to show it. She could cry on command, tremble at will, and turn weakness into seduction. Men called her childlike. In truth, she was calculating in ways they could never understand. Lancaster wrote of the year 1959 during the filming of Some Like It Hot. The set had become chaos. Days turned into nights of waiting, of endless retakes, because Marilyn would simply vanish without a word. Producers pleaded, directors begged, cameras stood still while the crew whispered in exhaustion. When she finally appeared, she would tilt her head, smile that famous smile, and say softly, "I'm ready now." And everyone forgave her because no one dared to risk being the one who angered Marilyn Monroe. She wasn't late by accident. She was teaching everyone how much they needed her. That was her true genius control, hidden behind chaos. Each disappearance made her more mysterious, more irreplaceable. Even the people she hurt defended her, claiming she was simply fragile, misunderstood, a victim of fame. But Lancaster's notes suggested something colder. He wrote, "She used her fragility the way a general uses an army." By the early 1960s, Marilyn had become more myth than woman. Her beauty opened every door, but behind those doors she played a more dangerous game, balancing the affections of the most powerful men in America, producers, politicians, and moguls who mistook her silence for submission. She collected secrets the way others collected jewelry. Those secrets became her currency, her protection, and eventually her curse. In 1961, she began a relationship with producer Jack Warner. At first, it was passion then leverage. When Warner tried to cast another actress in a leading role, Marilyn collapsed into hysterics, threatening to walk away from the studio unless her demands were met. She wept, screamed, locked herself in her dressing room, and within hours Warner surrendered. She had won again. But the victory was hollow. Each triumph isolated her further, until there was no one left she didn't control or fear. Burt Lancaster's diary described visiting a party at her home. He wrote of a room filled with laughter that sounded rehearsed, of friends too nervous to relax. "It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff," he said, "because you knew someone would fall and she would be the one to push them." Behind the glamour lay dependency. The sleeping pills that calmed her mind began to dictate her life. She alternated between bursts of radiant energy and days of paralysis. Every man who entered her orbit, directors, lovers, friends, tried to save her, not realizing she didn't want salvation. She wanted control over who would try. The media portrayed her as the perfect tragedy, a fallen angel destroyed by fame. But Lancaster saw the story differently. He believed Marilyn was not consumed by Hollywood, she consumed it. Every headline, every scandal, every whispered rumor fed her legend until even death could not silence her. When news broke on the morning of August 5th, 1962, that Marilyn Monroe had been found dead in her Los Angeles home, the world mourned. Reporters called it an overdose, a mistake, a tragedy. Lancaster called it inevitable. He wrote, "She lived like a supernova, brighter than anyone, burning herself and everyone near her to ash." In the pages that followed, his tone changed. There was no anger, no accusation, only sorrow. He saw in her the perfect reflection of the industry itself, dazzling on the surface, hollow beneath. Marilyn had been Hollywood's most successful creation and its most devastating casualty. Lancaster ended her chapter with words that feel like an epitaph carved in stone. She was not destroyed by others. She was destroyed by the gravity of her own light. And with that final sentence, the diary moved from tragedy to pure darkness. The next name was a man once celebrated as a hero, admired for his charm and elegance. But, according to Lancaster, behind that charm lived a monster wearing a gentleman's smile. Errol Flynn. The name still drips with nostalgia, the charming rogue, the dashing swordsman, the man who could make audiences believe in adventure again. To millions, he was a symbol of elegance and rebellion, the kind of hero who fought with a smirk and lived without fear. But to Burt Lancaster, he was something entirely different. In his notebook, he called Flynn the devil who wore a gentleman's smile. Flynn was born to play the part of the hero. Tall, magnetic, reckless, he was the living embodiment of charisma. But beneath that charm, Lancaster wrote, there was no soul, only appetite. He lived as if the world existed to satisfy him. Money, fame, women, respect. He took them all with the same arrogance, and he always wanted more. By the late 1930s, Errol Flynn had become Hollywood's golden idol. His name filled theaters, his face graced every magazine cover. But the higher he climbed, the darker his nights became. He built a reputation for wild parties that blurred into chaos gatherings where pleasure and cruelty mingled until no one could tell the difference. Lancaster described those nights in words that felt almost like a confession. They called it glamour, but when the lights went out, it was closer to damnation. Flynn's mansion in Beverly Hills was said to be a palace of temptation. There were rooms no guest entered twice, corridors filled with laughter that didn't sound human. Women arrived dazzled by his charm and left in silence, never speaking of what had happened behind those closed doors. Even among the stars people used to indulgence and scandal, there were whispers about him. Whispers too dangerous to say aloud. In 1942, Flynn was accused of crimes that could have destroyed any ordinary man. But he was not ordinary. He was protected by the machinery of fame by studios, lawyers, and publicists who understood that his downfall would cost millions. The case was buried under charm and influence. The newspapers turned it into a circus, and when the curtain closed, Errol Flynn walked away smiling, untouched. The public saw a man vindicated. Hollywood saw a man reminded of his power. Lancaster wrote, "That trial didn't break him, it crowned him." After that, Flynn's behavior became even more dangerous. He no longer bothered to hide his excesses. His house became a fortress for the elite actors, producers, politicians, all of them drawn to his magnetic corruption. There were rumors of drugs, of violence, of acts that blurred the line between pleasure and punishment. And yet, no one dared to speak. Flynn had become too powerful, too charming, too useful to the image of Hollywood itself. He was living proof that the system protected its monsters as long as they made money. Lancaster's diary described one night in 1953. He had attended a private gathering at Flynn's estate, one of those legendary events whispered about in studio corridors. He wrote of faces smiling under fear, of guests pretending not to see what was happening around them. Flynn, drunk and laughing, commanded the room like a king who owned not only the house, but every soul inside it. When one guest tried to leave early, Flynn blocked the door and told him, "Nobody leaves my stage until I say the show's over." The laughter that followed was hollow, and no one moved. That was the real Errol Flynn, a man addicted not to pleasure, but to power. Every conquest, every scandal, every moment of chaos was proof that he could still control the narrative. The world saw his charisma. Lancaster saw his hunger, a hunger that devoured everyone who came too close, but even predators meet their end. As the years passed, Flynn's body began to fail him. The once golden hero grew pale, his health collapsing under the weight of alcohol and guilt. He still smiled for the cameras, but his eyes told the truth the devil's mask was slipping. He was no longer feared, he was pitied. And perhaps in some final act of twisted justice, that was the punishment Hollywood gave him. In his final note on Flynn, Lancaster wrote, "He played Robin Hood, but stole far more than gold. He stole innocence, he stole trust, he stole the illusion that heroes are real." When Errol Flynn died in 1959, the obituaries called him a legend. They spoke of adventure, charm, and timeless talent. But in the pages of the secret diary, he was remembered differently as the man who proved that Hollywood could turn even the devil into a star. And as Lancaster's pen moved to the next name, the tone of his writing shifted again. The next figure was not a reckless seducer, nor a glamorous goddess. He was something quieter, but far more terrifying. A man who wore decency like armor, whose violence hid behind a glass of whiskey and a calm smile. Spencer Tracy. To the world, he was the actor's actor, the symbol of honesty, discipline, and moral strength. His voice carried authority, his face radiated decency. He was the kind of man audiences trusted, the kind who made them believe that good still existed in a corrupt world. But in Burt Lancaster's secret notebook, that image shattered completely. Tracy was no saint. He was a tyrant, one who ruled not through charm or intellect, but through fear. Lancaster began Tracy's chapter with words that felt almost reluctant, as if even he was uncomfortable writing them. He was a man built of contradictions, admired by millions, feared by everyone who knew him. To the camera, Tracy was calm, precise, professional. But the moment the cameras stopped rolling, he transformed. The whiskey glass became his weapon, and the set became his kingdom. He drank not for pleasure, but for control, for the power that came from turning a quiet conversation into chaos. Lancaster described him as the devil in the dressing room, a man who arrived on set with a smile, then spent the day slowly unraveling the people around him. The more he drank, the sharper his cruelty became. He mocked, insulted, and frightened the very people who admired him. He would snap at makeup artists, slam doors in the faces of assistants, and explode at directors over the smallest mistake. His rage wasn't spontaneous, it was ritual. He needed it like fuel. Lancaster recalled one moment that stayed with him for years. It was during the filming of Judgment in Nuremberg, a movie about morality and justice, two things Tracy no longer seemed to believe in. After a minor wardrobe error, he smashed a bottle on the makeup table and screamed until everyone in the room froze. No one spoke. No one moved. He looked at their terrified faces, then smiled faintly and said, "That's better." To Lancaster, it was as if he had rehearsed cruelty the same way he rehearsed his lines. He knew exactly how far to push, when to pause, when to make people think the storm was over, only to start it again. The tragedy of Spencer Tracy wasn't just his temper, it was how well he hid it. Audiences adored his roles, the wise father, the humble worker, the man of conscience. But those characters were masks carved from his own guilt. Behind closed doors, he was known for manipulation threats, mind games, and emotional torture that broke down even the strongest personalities. Lancaster's notes revealed a disturbing pattern. Tracy used alcohol not only to escape himself, but to dominate others. It gave him permission to say what he truly thought, and what he thought most of the time was that he was superior. He saw everyone as a prop, Lancaster wrote, and believed the scene couldn't exist without him. He carried that arrogance into his private life. There were rumors of affairs that turned violent, of co-stars who avoided him outside the set, of assistants who refused to work with him twice. When his anger couldn't be contained, he would lock himself away for days, not out of remorse, but to let others wonder when the next explosion would come. Fear was his form of control. Lancaster compared him to a bomb that never fully exploded, one that kept ticking just loud enough for everyone to hear. "You could feel it in the air," he wrote, "the weight of waiting for him to break again." In one chilling passage, Lancaster described visiting Tracy during a period of heavy drinking. He found him sitting in silence, staring at his reflection. On the table beside him were scattered pages from a script. Without turning, Tracy said softly, "You know what they don't understand, Bert. I don't act. I just hide better than the rest of them." Those words haunted Lancaster. He realized then that Tracy wasn't simply cruel, he was hollow. A man who had spent so long pretending to be good that he'd forgotten what goodness actually felt like. His characters on screen weren't expressions of virtue. They were reminders of the man he could never be. By the end of his career, the industry had forgiven everything. They said he was brilliant, tormented, misunderstood. But Lancaster saw the truth. Spencer Tracy didn't need forgiveness. He needed witnesses, people who would see his rage and still call it genius. That was his addiction. Not alcohol, not fame, but the twisted satisfaction of being both adored and feared at once. Lancaster ended Tracy's chapter with a single devastating line. He could play God, saint, or sinner, but when the lights went out, he was only the drunk who believed he owned the world. The next page of the notebook was smeared with ink, as if written through trembling hands. And there, beneath the blotches, was a name few would ever expect to follow. A man beloved for his decency, his humility, his charm. A man who to the outside world was the embodiment of kindness itself. But, according to Burt Lancaster, that kindness was a mask, and behind it lived one of the coldest hearts in Hollywood. James Stewart. To generations he was the very image of goodness, the kind neighbor, the honest man, the moral compass of an era when America still believed in heroes. With his gentle voice and earnest eyes, he played the everyman who always did the right thing, the man who fought corruption, who defended justice, who never gave up on decency. But according to Burt Lancaster, that image was the most perfect disguise Hollywood ever created. In his notebook, Lancaster called him the man who smiled like mercy, but judged like God. On the screen, Stewart was kindness made human. Off-screen, Lancaster described a man consumed by quiet arrogance, a performer who saw morality not as a virtue, but as a weapon. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. He controlled through silence. His calm voice and polite manners hid something far more chilling, a belief that he had the right to decide who deserved success and who didn't. Lancaster wrote, "Stewart destroyed people not with violence, but with patience. He waited, he observed, and when the time came, he acted like a judge passing sentence." In the late 1950s, during the filming of Anatomy of a Murder, Lancaster noticed how Stewart interacted with the cast. He never argued, never raised his voice. Instead, he watched, noting every mistake, every hesitation, every insecurity. At the end of each day, he would quietly share those observations with the director, suggesting who was losing focus, who wasn't right for the part. Those actors were often replaced before the film wrapped. No one ever suspected him. They thanked him for being kind. That was his genius cruelty disguised as concern. Lancaster called it moral assassination. In another entry, he described a young assistant who admired Stewart deeply. The assistant had made a simple scheduling mistake that caused a minor delay in production. Stewart didn't scold him. He simply stared at him, then said softly, "I'm disappointed." Those 2 words were enough. The assistant quit the next day. No yelling, no confrontation, just the weight of disappointment from a man the world thought incapable of cruelty. To Lancaster, that moment revealed who Stewart truly was, a man who had mastered the art of judgment. He didn't punish people with anger. He punished them with the feeling that they had sinned against something pure. There were other stories, ones that never reached the press. A co-star who found her name quietly erased from a poster after she disagreed with him. A cameraman who was blacklisted after Stewart accused him of unprofessional behavior. The accusations were vague, impossible to challenge. But in Hollywood, a whisper from someone like James Stewart was enough to end a career. Burt Lancaster described a conversation they once had during a late-night shoot. He had asked Stewart if he ever worried about the power he held. Stewart smiled and said, "Power? I don't have power. I just have influence. The rest is up to people's choices." But Lancaster knew better. Influence was power, and Stewart used it with precision. What made him truly dangerous was how pure his mask appeared. No one wanted to believe he was capable of malice. He was America's symbol of virtue, and virtue, when corrupted, becomes something far darker than evil. He punished without punishment, Lancaster wrote. He condemned without ever speaking a harsh word. The diary also revealed something more personal, a story from 1957 that Lancaster almost didn't include. During the production of a film that paired Stewart with a young black actor, Stewart refused to share the screen in one critical scene. He never shouted. He never demanded. He simply told the director it doesn't fit the story. And that was enough. The scene was cut. The actor's role diminished. Stewart had achieved his goal quietly, efficiently, without ever dirtying his hands. He didn't argue morality, he performed it. Lancaster's final description of him was both haunting and tragic. He wrote, "He was a mirror, reflecting the man you wanted to believe he was, and when you looked close enough, you saw your own guilt staring back at you." James Stewart lived his entire life as the embodiment of virtue, yet behind that smile was a ledger, and every name he crossed off it carried another broken dream. He never needed to shout or strike. He only had to look at you, and you felt unworthy. By the time Lancaster finished his notes on Stewart, the admiration had turned to sorrow, because he understood something terrible. The world didn't just love men like James Stewart, it needed them. The illusion of goodness was more valuable to Hollywood than goodness itself. And so the diary moved on from one silent judge to another. The next entry bore a name that carried the weight of authority and respect, the man who defined heroism on the screen. But Lancaster's words stripped away that nobility and revealed the truth beneath it. The truth about a man who ruled not through anger or words, but through silence. Henry Fonda. To the public, he was the voice of justice, the quiet strength of America. The man who stood for truth in 12 Angry Men, who defended the poor in the grapes of wrath, who reminded the world that integrity could still survive in the age of greed. He was the noble father, the honest citizen, the hero who never compromised. But Burt Lancaster's notebook told a different story, one that shattered the myth of righteousness that had defined Fonda's career. In Lancaster's words, he didn't raise his hand, he didn't shout, he killed with silence. It was not the violence of his temper that frightened people, it was the violence of his calm. Fonda had a presence that filled every room, a stare that could pierce through people like glass. Those who worked with him described feeling judged even when he said nothing. He didn't have to assert power, he simply was power. Lancaster wrote that Henry Fonda carried within him a controlled cruelty, a form of dominance that required no words. "No, but," he commanded with disappointment. He broke people without ever appearing to try. At home, that silence became a weapon. His daughter, Jane Fonda, once spoke publicly about the distance between them, the emotional void she could never cross. To the world, he was the model father. To his family, he was a shadow, distant, cold, unreachable. He didn't need to strike or shout. His disapproval was enough to crush the spirit of anyone who sought his affection. Lancaster noted, he lived like a priest without faith, strict, unforgiving, incapable of love. Even in the studio, Fonda's authority ruled every production he touched. He was respected, even worshipped, but never loved. He made his colleagues nervous, not through aggression, but through precision. Every line he delivered, every movement he made was deliberate, controlled, and he demanded the same from everyone else. Mistakes were not corrected. They were punished through isolation, through exclusion, through quiet dismissal. Lancaster recalled a conversation with a young actor who once worked with Fonda. The actor said, "When Henry looks at you, it's like he's already decided who you are, and there's nothing you can do to change it." That, Lancaster believed, was his truest form of cruelty. He didn't destroy with anger, he destroyed with certainty. At home, his silence shaped the people around him into reflections of his control. Jane Fonda would later describe her childhood as living under constant judgment, every action measured, every mistake magnified. She loved him, feared him, and resented him all at once. He gave her success but withheld affection. He taught her discipline but never warmth. It was as if Henry Fonda loved the idea of being a father more than the act itself. Lancaster wrote, "He built his family the same way he built his performances, with precision, but without soul. The few friends who dared to confront him found themselves frozen by his indifference. When conflict arose, he didn't argue. He withdrew. His silence became a punishment that could last for days or weeks, until the other person broke and begged for reconciliation. That was when he returned, calm, collected, victorious. The control never wavered. As Fonda aged, that same stillness turned into something heavier guilt. He had built a life that demanded perfection, but perfection isolates. By the time illness began to take its toll, he had surrounded himself with admirers but no true companions. Even his daughter Jane later admitted that she only began to understand her father after his death, when she realized that the warmth he denied others was the same warmth he had been denied himself. In one of his final entries, Lancaster described visiting Fonda near the end of his life. The great actor was frail, his voice soft, his presence smaller than had ever been. They spoke for hours, reminiscing about old films, old sets, the changing world of cinema. Then, as the evening ended, Fonda looked at Lancaster and said quietly, "You know, Burt, I played all those men who stood for justice, but I don't think I ever understood what mercy was." Lancaster never forgot these words. In the diary, he called them the confession of a man who realized too late that virtue without compassion is just another form of cruelty. Henry Fonda had lived as Hollywood's perfect hero, but in his pursuit of moral purity, he had become something else, a man who ruled his world through fear and called it discipline. He had become a monument to restraint, but inside that monument was emptiness. Lancaster ended his account with a sentence that felt like a verdict. He played justice, but never kindness. He demanded perfection, but offered no forgiveness, and the world mistook that for greatness. And as his pen lifted from the page, Lancaster's next note bore a name that felt inevitable, one that carried the legacy of Henry Fonda's coldness into a new generation. A woman who inherited not just his fame, but also his thirst for control. To the public, she was an activist, a symbol of rebellion. But to those who knew her closely, she was her father's daughter in every way, driven, brilliant, and merciless when crossed. Jane Fonda. To some, she was courage made flesh, the voice of a generation, the fearless actress who became an icon of protest and reform. To others, she was controversy itself, a woman who divided America with her words and actions. But to Burt Lancaster, she was something far more complex and far more dangerous. In his private notebook, Lancaster described her not as a hero or a villain, but as a strategist. He wrote, "Jane doesn't shout to be heard, she whispers until the world believes she's its conscience. She was born into privilege, raised in the shadow of her father's cold perfection." Henry Fonda's silence carved her into something sharp, a woman determined never to be powerless again. But the tools she used to seize that power were not kindness, or compassion, or even art. They were ideology, manipulation, and fear. Lancaster wrote that Jane had the mind of a general hidden behind the face of an angel. She learned early that persuasion could be more effective than confrontation. Instead of forcing people to obey, she made them want to obey. And in that subtle control, she found her truest talent. During the 1970s, Jane Fonda became the voice of rebellion. Her activism against the Vietnam War turned her from movie star to political figure, a symbol of defiance in an age of confusion. The cameras followed her everywhere, the protests, the speeches, the famous trip to Hanoi that earned her the name Hanoi Jane. To her supporters, she was brave. To her critics, she was a traitor. But Lancaster's diary peeled back the public story to expose the personal cost of her power. He wrote, "She didn't just fight for a cause, she built an army and demanded loyalty as absolute as faith." On film sets, she carried the same authority she brought to politics. She expected total agreement, absolute alignment with her beliefs. Anyone who disagreed wasn't just wrong, they were immoral. One cameraman recalled how, after expressing a conservative opinion, he was immediately removed from production. No one questioned it. No one wanted to be next. Lancaster described one incident during the filming of Coming Home in 1978. Fonda reportedly argued with a technician about how a scene depicting veterans should be lit. When he disagreed, she called a meeting and declared that his attitude reflected the problem with America. The next day he was gone. She had turned her cause into a weapon, one that could ruin reputations with a single statement. And yet she always did it with a smile. Her tone remained calm, her words rational. That was her true genius. She didn't destroy careers with rage, she did it with righteousness. Lancaster saw her influence spreading beyond cinema. She became a voice that shaped how others thought, how they spoke, how they behaved. People admired her intelligence, her beauty, her conviction, but many feared her approval more than they valued her friendship. To please her, Lancaster wrote, was to surrender your thoughts. To oppose her was to lose everything. Even in private, Jane's power was magnetic and suffocating. Friends who once adored her began to drift away, describing her as impossible to disagree with. She surrounded herself with people who echoed her beliefs, creating an echo chamber where her version of truth became law. In that environment, doubt was betrayal. Lancaster confessed that even he, a man known for his independence, once hesitated to challenge her. He admired her brilliance, but he feared her ability to twist logic into loyalty. He described her as a preacher who didn't believe in forgiveness. In one particularly haunting entry, he recalled a private conversation. Jane had told him, "You have to choose, Burt. You're either on the right side of history or you're part of the problem." It was the kind of sentence that sounded noble, even moral. But to Lancaster it carried something colder, an ultimatum disguised as virtue. He realized then that Jane Fonda didn't seek understanding, she sought obedience. Her charisma was her weapon. Her moral certainty was her shield. She never needed to shout, because she'd mastered something far more effective for the performance of purity. To disagree with her wasn't to debate, it was to sin. By the 1980s, Jane had reshaped her image once again, from activist to fitness queen. Her exercise empire sold millions of tapes, turning her into one of the most influential women in America. And yet, even there, Lancaster saw the same pattern. Behind the pastel leotards and upbeat energy was control. She told women how to move, how to look, how to live, and they listened. Because when Jane Fonda spoke, it wasn't just advice, it was doctrine. Lancaster ended her chapter with words that felt like both admiration and warning. She learned from her father how to command without love, but unlike him, she learned to smile while doing it. Jane Fonda's legacy was not cruelty in the traditional sense. It was conviction so powerful it became tyranny, the belief that she was always right, that the world must bend to her truth. And the most frightening part? She convinced millions to agree. Lancaster's final line about her reads, "She didn't change Hollywood, she programmed it." The next page of the diary took a darker turn, still away from glamour, away from politics, and into the hidden heart of family cruelty. A man whose calm voice and gentle manner masked something far more sinister. A father whose love was punishment, whose control left scars that never healed. Bing Crosby. The name alone once brought warmth to millions. The smooth voice that sang White Christmas, the easy smile that could calm a restless world. To the public, he was the embodiment of kindness, the man who made America believe that everything would be all right. But in Burt Lancaster's secret diary, Crosby's home was not filled with music or laughter. It was filled with silence, control, and fear. Lancaster titled this chapter The Father of Shadows. He wrote, "He never raised his hand when words could wound deeper. His cruelty was measured, his punishments rehearsed. He ruled his home like a conductor directing misery." In public, Bing Crosby was charm itself, humble, courteous, deeply religious. He played the gentleman flawlessly. But behind the closed doors of his mansion, that serenity turned into domination. His children were not raised, they were disciplined. His house was not a home, it was a stage, and every member of his family knew their lines by heart. Lancaster described visiting Crosby's home once during the late 1950s. What he witnessed stayed with him for the rest of his life. He wrote, "His son stood in the yard without coat, his hands shaking in the cold. Bing watched him from the window and said nothing. When I asked why, he smiled and said, 'He failed his exam. He needs to learn how failure feels.'" That image, a child trembling in silence, punished not with blows, but with humiliation, haunted Lancaster. He realized then that Crosby's gentleness was an illusion. He didn't need violence to control. He used fear so efficiently that violence became unnecessary. Bing's methods were psychological. He believed obedience was the same as love. When his sons disappointed him, he withdrew affection completely days, sometimes weeks of cold indifference, until they broke down in apology. It was a kind of torture that left no bruises, only invisible scars. In the entertainment world, Crosby's reputation remained untouchable. He was the golden voice, the clean image, the perfect father. But inside his own family, he was something closer to a warden. His sons grew up in a climate of quiet terror, knowing that the same man who charmed the nation could, at any moment, turn into their judge. One of those sons, Gary Crosby, would later reveal the truth in his autobiography. He described the beatings, the cold punishments, the endless need to earn a father's love that never came. His words confirmed everything Lancaster had written decades earlier. Gary said, "I would rather have been the child of a criminal than of Bing Crosby." Lancaster's notebook included that quote, underlined twice. He wrote beside it, "The voice that soothed the world built a private hell." But Crosby's control didn't stop at his children. He extended it to his wives, his servants, even his friends. No one was safe from his quiet authority. He had the uncanny ability to make others feel small, to make their gratitude a form of submission. Every compliment came with expectation, every kindness came with debt. Lancaster wrote, "He smiled not out of joy, but to remind others that they owed him peace." Religion, too, became one of his tools. Crosby often spoke of morality, of discipline, of the importance of faith, yet he used those very beliefs to justify the suffering he inflicted. To him, punishment was not cruelty, it was correction. He believed fear was the path to virtue. In a particularly chilling passage, Lancaster recalled a dinner conversation where Crosby said, "You can't raise good men without breaking them first." Those words revealed everything. For Bing, control was not just a habit, it was a philosophy. The world adored him. The world sang his songs. But in the diary, Lancaster wrote that Bing Crosby was a man who mistook obedience for love and fear for faith. His family lived not in harmony, but in silence, the silence of people too afraid to speak the truth. When Bing Crosby died in 1977, the newspapers called him America's favorite father. They wrote tributes about his kindness, his songs, his legacy. But his eldest son didn't attend the funeral. Gary Crosby said simply, "Why mourn the man who never let me live?" Lancaster's final note on Crosby reads like an epitaph for the illusion of Hollywood's wholesome heroes. He sang of peace, but his home was war. He brought comfort to millions and misery to his own blood. He taught the world to dream of warmth while standing in the cold himself. But Crosby's legacy did not end with him. As Lancaster turned the page, he found the next name, the one that made even his steady handwriting tremble. The name of Bing's son, the boy who had once stood shivering in the yard, now grown into a man carrying his father's curse. Gary Crosby. The son who grew up in the shadow of a legend. The boy who smiled beside his famous father on Christmas albums and television specials, pretending to live the dream millions envied. But behind those songs, behind those perfect photographs, was a truth darker than any melody could conceal. He was not raised by love. He was forged by fear. Burt Lancaster's diary called him the son of violence. He wrote, "The world pitied him as a victim, but victims who grow up in cages learn to build their own." Gary's life was a reflection of the man who made him. Bing Crosby's control had shaped him into something hollow, a man desperate to be seen, desperate to be free, yet incapable of escaping the lessons of cruelty he had inherited. The cycle had begun long before Gary realized it. A father's silence had become his inner voice. A father's punishment had become his instinct. Lancaster described Gary as a boy who learned early that pain was the price of approval. He spent his youth trying to earn what could never be given, his father's love. Every achievement, every attempt at affection was met with indifference or disdain. When he made mistakes, punishment came swiftly. When he succeeded, praise never followed. Love in the Crosby home was conditional, and Gary failed the test before he ever had a chance to pass it. By adulthood, the damage was complete. The boy who had been broken by obedience grew into a man who only understood control. He became volatile, unpredictable, cruel in the same quiet way his father had been. But unlike Bing, Gary didn't hide behind charm or reputation. He carried his anger openly, as if daring the world to confront him. Lancaster wrote, "He became the echo of his father's rage, louder but emptier." In the 1960s, Gary's public image began to crumble. There were rumors of drunken fights, assaults, and scandals that the studios tried to bury. He was accused of violence toward women, of attacking colleagues, of unpredictable bursts of rage. Each incident seemed to follow the same pattern, a brief moment of guilt followed by deeper denial. He blamed the world, the press, the shadow of his father, but he never blamed himself. Lancaster noted, he thought he was defying Bing. In truth, he was becoming him. There was one night Lancaster described that captured Gary's dissent perfectly. At a dinner in Los Angeles, surrounded by industry friends, Gary grew angry over a harmless joke. He stormed out, smashed the windshield of a director's car, and disappeared into the night. When confronted later, he laughed and said, "That's what happens when people forget who I am." It was Bing's voice reborn in his son. Drugs followed, then alcohol, then scandal. Gary Crosby drifted from project to project, destroying every chance he was given. Hollywood, once willing to forgive the sins of fame, turned its back on him. He became a relic, a man who had inherited the spotlight, but lost the light within himself. His relationships were equally turbulent. He hurt the women who loved him, lashed out at friends who tried to help, and found himself increasingly isolated. Every wound he inflicted on others was, in some way, a wound he was trying to erase from himself. But pain, once learned as language, becomes impossible to unlearn. Lancaster's diary revealed a painful empathy for him. He didn't excuse Gary's cruelty, but he understood it. He wrote, "He was a man who had been taught to confuse love with fear, respect with obedience, tenderness with control. He didn't want to be his father, he simply didn't know how to be anything else." Gary's final years were marked by regret. He tried to make peace with his past, to confront the ghost of the man who had shaped him. But even then, his apologies came too late. The people he had hurt had already learned to live without him, and the father he could never please had long since died. When Gary Crosby passed away in 1995, few noticed. There were no glowing obituaries, no tributes to his career, just a brief mention, the son of Bing Crosby. That was all he ever was, and perhaps all he ever could be. Lancaster ended his account with haunting precision. He was the proof that cruelty breeds cruelty, that pain, once planted, grows in generations. Gary did not inherit his father's fame, he inherited his curse. For Lancaster, the tragedy of Gary Crosby was not that he failed to escape his father's shadow. It was that he carried that shadow forward, ensuring that the darkness lived on. The sins of one generation had been reborn in the next. And as Lancaster turned the final pages of his secret notebook, he found himself staring into a different kind of darkness not inherited, but chosen. A woman who didn't learn cruelty, she crafted it. A woman who had turned violence into art and control into ritual. She was neither victim nor puppet, she was the hand that pulled the strings. Joan Crawford. Few names carry as much contradiction, beauty and terror, glamour and cruelty, devotion and destruction. To the world, she was the face of determination. The woman who rose from poverty to become one of the brightest stars of Hollywood's golden age. She embodied success, power, and control, everything the industry admired and feared. But in Burt Lancaster's secret notebook, Crawford was not a symbol of triumph. She was the embodiment of discipline gone mad, a woman who ruled her world with violence disguised as order. Lancaster titled her chapter simply The Queen of Pain. He began it with the line, "She did not seek love. She sought control, and when love resisted, she replaced it with fear." Joan Crawford's life was a study in transformation. Born Lucille LeSueur in 1904, she grew up poor, unwanted, and invisible. From the beginning, she understood that survival meant reinvention. Every gesture, every smile, every word she spoke as an adult was rehearsed the creation of a character named Joan Crawford. The woman the world adored was an invention, built to bury the girl who had once been powerless. But the cost of that transformation was immense. She didn't just erase her past, she made sure no one around her could escape her control. As her fame grew, so did her obsession with perfection. Her home became an extension of her career, immaculate, rigid, and terrifyingly precise. Nothing was ever out of place. Nothing was ever good enough. Lancaster described her house as a cathedral of order. Every object had its position, every meal had its ritual. Even her children were props in the performance of her perfect life. They were dressed, photographed, and disciplined to match her vision. Behind the photographs of smiling faces and matching clothes were nights of tears and punishment. Her daughter, Christina Crawford, would later reveal the truth in her book, Mommy Dearest. The world read it in shock, the coat hanger beatings, the endless rules, the emotional torment. To Lancaster, these weren't rumors or exaggerations. He had seen the signs long before the book was published. He wrote, "I once visited her home. There was a silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like fear wearing pearls." Joan Crawford's violence was not the product of rage, it was the product of control. Every slap, every cruel word was her way of reminding the world that she had power. She had once been invisible. She would never be powerless again. Lancaster noted, "She punished her children not because they disobeyed, but because they reminded her of weakness. In their mistakes, she saw her own childhood. In their vulnerability, she saw the girl she had buried and she despised her. Her cruelty wasn't limited to her family. On set, she terrified entire crews. Assistants worked in silence, afraid of triggering her wrath. Directors learned to flatter her before giving direction. Even seasoned co-stars tread carefully around her, knowing that a single wrong word could make her an enemy for life. She demanded loyalty and submission. Those who offered anything less were erased, replaced, blacklisted, or humiliated. She was known to have destroyed careers with a single call, a single rumor. Her beauty was her mask, her fame her armor, her will her weapon. Lancaster wrote, "She lived every day like a war she had already won, but still fought just to hear the screams of surrender." Despite everything, there were moments, brief, fleeting moments when the mask cracked. Lancaster remembered one encounter at a charity gala. Crawford, surrounded by admirers, seemed untouchable. But when the lights dimmed and the music softened, he saw her sitting alone, her expression hollow. For a moment, she looked lost, like a woman who had built a fortress so high that even she couldn't escape it. Then someone approached her for a photograph, and instantly the smile returned. The performance resumed. That, Lancaster believed, was her tragedy. She wasn't just cruel to others, she was cruel to herself. She had turned pain into a religion and ruled over it like a queen. She could not stop performing because the moment she did, she would have to face the emptiness beneath it. In her final years, Joan Crawford withdrew from the world she once commanded. Her fame faded, her beauty dimmed, and the cameras stopped calling. For the first time, she was alone, truly alone, and she couldn't bear it. She locked herself away in her apartment, refusing visitors, refusing to be seen without her makeup. When she died in 1977, her funeral was sparsely attended. Her daughter did not come. The star who had demanded devotion her entire life was left with silence. Lancaster ended her chapter with a line that felt more like a curse than a summary. She believed pain was strength, but in the end, all she built was fear, and fear cannot love you back. He closed that section of his diary with a single final note. Every queen needs a crown. Hers was made of iron and sorrow. And as the ink began to fade, the next name appeared beneath hers, the last on the list. A woman whose laughter had once brought joy to millions, whose face had become the symbol of happiness itself. But behind that laughter, Burt Lancaster discovered something else, a cruelty so polished it gleamed. Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball. The world remembers her laughter, loud, contagious, unforgettable. She was the woman who made America smile, who brought color into black and white lives, who became the beating heart of television's golden age. To millions, she was joy personified, proof that comedy could cure sadness, that laughter could heal the world. But Burt Lancaster's secret notebook described something else entirely. Behind the laughter, he wrote, was a blade sharp enough to draw blood. He called her the razor behind the smile. Lucille Ball's life was a paradox. She began as a struggling model, clawing her way into Hollywood through rejection after rejection. Every no only hardened her will. She wasn't born to be adored, she engineered it. She built herself from discipline, calculation, and absolute control. Every gesture, every expression, every burst of laughter was deliberate, a science of comedy wrapped around an unyielding core. When I Love Lucy became the most watched show in America, Lucille Ball transformed from performer to empire. She was no longer an actress, she was a brand, a symbol of optimism and family. But within the walls of Desilu Productions, where she reigned as the head of one of Hollywood's biggest studios, the mood was anything but warm. Lancaster wrote, she ruled her studio with the precision of a general and the cruelty of a surgeon. Her laughter filled rooms not with joy, but with fear. To outsiders, Desilu was a dream factory. Inside, it was a battleground. Lucille kept detailed notes on every employee. Mistakes were documented, behaviors recorded. She knew who arrived late, who whispered behind her back, who dared to question her. Those notes became her arsenal, and when she decided someone had crossed her, their name disappeared from the company as swiftly as it had been written down. Lancaster described one meeting that chilled him. A young writer had failed to deliver a script she approved of. Lucille summoned him, tossed the script across the room, and said, "You think you're funny, then laugh at this?" She fired him in front of everyone. Then she smiled the same smile that America adored and asked if anyone else had feedback. No one spoke. Her control extended far beyond the studio. Even her closest collaborators lived under the weight of her perfectionism. Her husband, Desi Arnaz, had once been her equal, charming, talented, magnetic. But as her power grew, his faded. What began as a marriage turned into a hierarchy. He drank, she commanded. The empire that bore both their names eventually belonged to one, her. When they divorced, Lucille didn't just take the company, she took control of the narrative. The world pitied her and blamed him. It was the most brilliant performance of her career. Lancaster wrote, Lucille never lost control, she only pretended to. Even in moments of kindness, there was calculation. She donated to charities, supported struggling actors, and mentored young women, but every act was measured, every favor remembered. Gratitude to her was a form of currency. She expected repayment, and those who failed to deliver were quietly erased. At Desilu, she had microphones installed in meeting rooms. Not for safety, not for records, For surveillance. She listened to her staff's private conversations, searching for disloyalty before it could grow. She called it efficiency. Lancaster called it paranoia. In his notes he wrote, "Her laughter once saved CBS, but it also destroyed countless people who could no longer stand the sound of it." He described one afternoon at a studio gathering. Lucille was surrounded by her team, recounting an old story from the show. Everyone laughed except one woman, who looked tired, distracted. Lucille noticed. She stopped mid-sentence, turned toward her, and said softly, "Something wrong, sweetheart?" The woman blushed, stammered, apologized. Lucille smiled and continued the story. The next morning, the woman's name was taken off the payroll. That was Lucille Ball's true genius. She made fear invisible. People didn't even realize they were afraid of her until it was too late. As Lancaster's writing deepened, so did his discomfort. He admired her brilliance but was disturbed by her precision. She had become everything Hollywood celebrated: powerful, independent, successful, but she'd also become what it secretly feared: a woman who didn't need to be loved to be obeyed. He wrote, "She weaponized joy. Her laughter wasn't an escape, it was an order. When she laughed, you were expected to follow." Even in her final years, long after the cameras stopped rolling, she remained the same, polished, proud, unyielding. Her legacy was untouchable, her reputation protected by the very myth she had built. But Lancaster believed that beneath the surface she had been consumed by the same darkness she inflicted on others. The need to control, the fear of losing power, the emptiness of a life performed too perfectly. His final words about her were simple, almost sorrowful. She was America's laughter, but when the cameras stopped, there was only the echo, sharp, hollow, and waiting for someone else to laugh. And with that, the final page of the notebook was nearly empty. Nearly because Burt Lancaster still had one more thing to write. Not a name this time, but a message. A conclusion to everything he had uncovered. A confession, perhaps, or a warning to those who would one day read what he had seen behind Hollywood's golden facade. The final pages of Burt Lancaster's secret notebook were different. Gone were the names, the scandals, the lists of cruelty and control. The handwriting itself had changed slower, heavier, as if each word carried a weight he could barely lift. He had written about gods of the screen and monsters of the soul. But here, at the end, his voice was quieter, less judgmental, almost mournful. He began simply, "If these stories are ever found, do not read them as revenge, read them as warning." Lancaster had spent a lifetime inside the illusion, the bright lights, the applause, the myth of Hollywood as a dream factory. He had seen how easily the dream could consume the dreamers, how fame turned decency into performance and performance into survival. He had seen kindness twisted into control, love reshaped into power, and laughter sharpened into a weapon. But above all, he had seen how the world wanted to be deceived. He wrote, "The audience never asked for the truth. They asked for a mirror that made them feel beautiful." Hollywood had given them that mirror, polished, shimmering, and full of lies. The stars reflected in it weren't human anymore. They were symbols, shadows of perfection projected across the world. And once you become a symbol, Lancaster believed, you stop being a person. You stop feeling. You stop living for yourself. You live for the myth. He continued, "Every name in this book began as a dreamer. Every one of them wanted to be loved. But in Hollywood, love is not given. It is rented for a price that no one can afford to pay for ever." He confessed that even he was not innocent. He had seen the cruelty and he had stayed silent. He had watched the manipulation, the fear, the abuse, and told himself it was none of his concern. He had laughed at the jokes, attended the parties, shaken hands with devils wearing diamonds. And for years he called it professionalism. "Silence," he wrote, "is the currency that keeps this machine alive." That silence, he believed, was the true corruption of Hollywood. Not the scandals, not the crimes, but the quiet acceptance of them. The way everyone looked away, pretending not to see, because exposure meant exile. He called it the law of survival under the lights. And yet, as he neared the end of his life, he began to wonder whether the real monsters were not the ones he had written about, but the system that made them. He wrote, "Hollywood does not create evil, it rewards it. It builds altars for it, calls it genius, and sells it to the world as art." He believed that power in Hollywood didn't corrupt, it revealed. Fame stripped people bare, showing the world who they truly were when nothing could touch them. For some, that meant generosity. For others, destruction. In his final entry, Lancaster turned his words inward. He asked a question not to anyone, but to himself. How many lives did we destroy chasing applause? How many people did we become to avoid being forgotten? And then came his last paragraph, the one that would haunt anyone who read it. He wrote, "When the lights go out, the stars don't disappear. They just stop pretending to shine. And in that darkness, you see what they really are, fragile, frightened, and human. That is Hollywood's greatest secret. Not the scandals, not the sins. The truth is simpler and crueler. We were all just people who wanted to be loved, and we forgot how." The final line was barely legible, written with trembling ink. "If there is a heaven for actors, it will be one without cameras." And that was where the notebook ended. No signature, no farewell. Just silence, the kind that feels heavier than any scream. Lancaster's words never made it to the headlines. The article that first revealed his secret notebook vanished from circulation almost as quickly as it appeared. Some said it was fake, some said it was buried by powerful hands, but perhaps it doesn't matter, because the truth of his warning still lingers not in ink, but in the air that surrounds the very idea of Hollywood. Behind every spotlight there is darkness, behind every smile a secret, behind every legend a price. And maybe in the end, Burt Lancaster's greatest performance was not the roles he played, but the courage to write what everyone else was too afraid to say.